who everyone is and what we're doing here. So tonight we have a special event with 2 guest speakers. So we've got Professor Adam Hart, who is an ecologist and the Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire. And we also have Sarah Wyndham-Lewis, who's an author and honey sommelier, and she's written a couple of books which I think she'll be drawing on this evening. And then we've got a couple of people from Bees Abroad. So I'm Christine Ratcliffe. I work on communications and fundraising at Bees Abroad. We've also got Rachel and Katerina. Katerina's the CEO. We have a few of our trustees and members, I think, and people from perhaps. Ben, are you a Bees Abroad person as well in Uganda? Who just waved? Yeah, it looks like it. Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining. Sarah, have you had any more luck?
Well, I'm just going to try this one more time and just open it. Right, can you see any of that? Because it should be shared. It says it's sharing, and it's just not. Start again. Share screen. Files.
Can't see.
No, it's just not, it just doesn't.
Oh, that's frustrating because it was working.
We had it working earlier. Do you want to run it, Christine? And I'll just do that next slide, please thing.
I've just emailed you mine as well, Christine. Just to,
okay.
Okay. Right.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can. Yours is behaving unlike mine. And I've got to just put down my mouse. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. Yes, I'm a honey sommelier, and I write about honey. I work with global honeys. I'm also, and in the context of tonight, probably more importantly, I'm co-founder of Bermondsey Street Bees. You will see that we have, it's a fairly glamorous list of awards. I just want to say to you, we're 2.5 people. We're not some massive, great organisation. My husband and I founded the practice in 2007, and we wanted it very much. We wanted to have a sustainable beekeeping practice. So over the years, we've sort of tried to develop and understand what that actually means. So if I can have the next slide, please, Christine. That word sustainable is a bit of a horror because everybody's using it all the time. You get sustainable this and sustainable that. So what I thought I'd talk about this evening, because I think it's important, is to try and define what the word sustainable means. And I'm going to look at it through 2 prisms. I'm going to look at it in the context of what it means for us as a sustainable practice in Britain, so in the developed world, and also what it means for people in the developing world, because they are very different things, and just try and find the hinge of what it is that makes something sustainable and the issues we need to discuss. So if I could have the next slide, please, that would be great.
Oh, it's making a strange noise.
There we are. So first of all, let's challenge the biggest myth going, which is that honeybees are going extinct. Honeybees are not going extinct. So this comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. These are very definitive figures. There's been a constant rise in the number of hives globally, little bits of ups and downs, but overall a really consistent rise since 1961 when these figures first started. What for me is really interesting is where that arrow is showing the whole drama of colony collapse in the USA, because that was at the point at which this whole save the bees mantra started to really get going, and people really still to this day feel that it is about honeybees. And whilst honeybees are, no bees of any species are enjoying the effects of industrialized agriculture, the huge use of chemicals, logging, urbanization, all of these are really challenging. But we have to remember that most honeybees are a kept species. So like chickens or sheep or whatever, their numbers are dependent on humans. And that's something we need to bear in mind when we talk about issues around sustainability. And we also have to remember the wild bees, which we'll talk about as well, because they're an important part of this jigsaw. So if I could have the next slide, please. This is not going to be popular, but it is something that people feel implicitly, that if they get honeybees, they also get a set of eco-creds. And my feeling is that they don't. You have to earn these if you are a beekeeper, particularly in today's environment. My grandfather was a beekeeper, and he very sweetly kept bees in skeps in his garden in central London in the 1920s to provide breakfast honey for his table and jars of honey for friends. Those days are sort of gone in quite large areas of the developed world. And we do need to look at the wider environment in which our bees are. So if I could have the next slide. I'm just going to show you a little quiz that I give beekeepers when I have a group of them at my mercy, if I'm talking to a BKA or something like that. So yeah, this is a wider world quiz. How many species of bee are there in the world? How many are honeybee species? Name the 3 other primary groupings and rank them in order. And we know that honeybees are generalist feeders. And what is it that they actually prefer to eat, given the choice? So if we'd have the answers up now, Christine, on the next slide, please. Thank you. So 25,000 approximately species of bee in the world, and 7 of those are honeybee species. So 0.03% of the total species of bee on Earth are honeybees. And you think of the precedence that they have and the emotional connection that human beings have with those honeybees, it's quite extraordinary. So the 3 other rankings, we've got 250 species of bumble, we've got the stingless bees in the tropics, and we've got these huge rump of solitary bees who are really important. Now, nature would not have that many bee species if we didn't need them. These bees are the guardians of biodiversity, and we have to understand that our honeybees have to work within a matrix that includes the welfare of these bees. And also the idea that honeybees are the ones who are going to be foraging in a wildflower meadow, I'm afraid is again wrong. We should be understanding what it is that our honeybees really are inclined to eat, and that is the flowering trees and bushes and herbaceous perennials, alongside which they evolved over 80 million years ago. I have to say that I have never had a group of people in front of me who could answer all these questions. I find that degree of detachment from the wider ecology in which our honeybees sit quite concerning, because it shows a narrow focus, which I think is one of the things we really need to address in sustainable beekeeping. Next slide, please. So we've been beekeeping, as opposed to honey hunting, beekeeping for more than 9,000 years, as far as the sort of latest figures seem to say. So it is an ancient and highly skilled craft. It runs across so many different cultures, and it has given us as humans so much. It's given us food, it's given us medicine, it's given us trade goods, and it has definitely laid the foundations for developing economies right across the world, and is still doing so to this day, vitally. So why is it, in this wonderful sort of, beneficial scenario of beekeeping, why is it that so many ecologists are now taking not just a negative view of beekeeping, but a very negative view of beekeeping? And this is the environment which beekeepers are slightly fighting back against. And I think we do need to fight back against it, but we need to fight back against it in very constructive ways, and by altering our opinions and our behavior somewhat in places. So if we could have the next screen, we'll look at what it is that the ecologists are saying. What they're saying is that because our honeybees are so numerous and such generalist feeders, and that they are operating often in places where they are not native, and that includes all of America and all of Australia, these kept honeybees, if there are large quantities of them, can change. They can negatively impact biodiversity in sensitive environments. And we'll sort of we need to take a look at what that sensitive word, they all start with S. So we've got sustainability, we've got sensitivity, and just say, what is a sensitive environment? Because, it's one of those things you could just throw away and say, So a sensitive environment can be very varied. We, over 6 or 7 years ago, started moving our bees out of central London. It was entirely clear to us the yields were falling, the disease rates were going up, and people were piling bees into central London beekeeping because they thought they were saving the bees. They knew nothing about bees, and they knew less than nothing about bee disease. So there was huge outbreaks of very, very serious bee diseases, EFB, and that it was about proximity. So we ended up with figures that showed us that there were by a factor of 3 times in London, 3 times the high density of anywhere in Europe, anywhere else in Europe. I reckon you can probably take that on to say 3 times in the world. Now, clearly in a city environment where you're losing green space, that becomes a sensitive environment, doesn't it? You're looking at something where everybody's pushing and shoving for the same forage resources. The honeybees are coming off really badly in that. But we know that the wild bees, their wild cousins who have to share those same resources, are going to come off worse because they're far more sensitive and far less able to numerically, forage in the sort of quantities that honeybees are going to descend on something. So we also have places like New South Wales who have declared honeybees an alien species, and they're being lobbied to ban them from their national parks because of the potential for honeybees to actually, in their pollinating preferences, alter the flora and hence onward the fauna of particularly delicate areas. So that's New South Wales with their alien species declaration. Cuba has already banned honeybees from some of its national parks and is already seeing recovery in some areas as having done that. And on our own doorstep, Denmark has taken steps to remove honeybees from some areas. So this is very real, and it is something that we do have to look at in terms of where we place our bees. So we have these comments here: high density beekeeping in natural areas appears to have lasting, more serious negative effects on biodiversity than was previously assumed. This was in 2019, and things have only hotted up from there. If we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. And so, here's a few more roundups of people's views. It's quite tough being a beekeeper when you've got a real pushback from very knowledgeable ecologists who have decided to take a really anti-honeybee stance. But I do feel that an awful lot of beekeeping needs to be better. We need to equip ourselves with far more knowledge, and we need to be more sensitive in our beekeeping. And that really is one of the sort of roots of a more sustainable approach to it. Could we have that next screen, please? Which is quite an interesting summary from Jeff Ollerton. Keeping hives to save the bees is like keeping chickens to save the birds. So if we just could have, again, the next slide on, I'd like to look at some of the motivations for beekeeping. So I'm afraid that an awful lot of motivation is sentiment. And why shouldn't you love bees? You should, if you want bees and you love bees, fine, have bees, but you're not saving the bees by getting those bees. Helping the environment, possibly not. Unlikely in many places. Ticking green boxes, there's a terrible lot of ticking green boxes at this time of year, because we were once London rooftop beekeepers and got a lot of publicity for it. People still think that that's what we're doing. We get, I would say, 3 or 4 approaches a month from companies, solicitors, whatever it may be in London, who want us to come and put bees on their roofs still, because the message hasn't got through. And often they're talking about the 10th floor or somewhere wholly inappropriate. And we say, no, we don't do that anymore. We never will do that anymore. It's not appropriate, but it hasn't stopped the green boxes popping up and people wanting to tick them. And then you have, on the other hand, practicality. You have the wonderful education opportunity that honeybees offer, because we can go and look at them. We can connect people with nature very directly through the honeybee and through the story of the honeybee to the flowers, to the soil, to the wider environment. And that's a really important job that they do. Crop pollination, another really important job that honeybees can do. especially, sadly, I'm afraid, in support of mass farming and big industrialized farming, things like the almond fields in California, where millions and millions and millions of bees die every year to provide us with almonds. If you don't know about this story, there's a very good Guardian article which you can look up, which is titled "It's Like Taking My Bees to War." And I recommend you read that if you don't know what's happening in America with the mass pollination. But in a smaller scale, at a more local level, crop pollination is very, very well done. A lot of crops by honeybees, but there are other crops which are better pollinated or co-pollinated by wild bees, which is another reason why we need to maintain the wild bee presence in our ecology. And income. Income from honey, income from wax, income from lots of associated crafts. That's a very valid reason to have bees. So I think it's clear that the motivations can vary hugely between the developed world and the developing countries. And there's a word coming up which is I think really significant here. So if we can have the next slide, please. And that's appropriate. It seems to me that the basis of sustainability is appropriateness. So what is appropriate for one location is extremely unlikely to work for another. The judgments that you make about it. On the left is my husband Dale with one of the first hives we ever had on our rooftop in Bermondsey Street, right by London Bridge, in the middle of London, overlooking the Shard. That would have been in about 2007, when London rooftop beekeeping was, something very new and very fabulous and seemed to be glorious and a really good thing to do. But we've had to revise our opinion of that and change. And you compare that to the beekeeping that you're seeing on the right hand side, it could not be more different. And so different concerns and different significant issues are going to guide the judgments about appropriateness in different locations. If we could possibly have the next one on. So appropriate in sustainability considerations, do we have appropriate motives for adding honeybees to the environment? I think we need to ask ourselves that. Every time we put a hive in place, we've got huge amounts of pollen and nectar required to keep a hive alive. Are they getting that at the expense of other hives? Are they getting that at the expense of their wild cousins and other pollinators? We need to be concerned about that. It's not the case that that's always going to be true, but it must be considered. We're very lucky in this country, in the UK and in lots of other countries too, that we do have at least the beginning of knowledge in terms of hive density from bee-base, which is not the be-all and end-all, sorry about the pun, but it does begin to give us some guidance in terms of looking at hive density. Can I have the next slide, please? So more appropriate, got ahead of myself there. So as other sustainability considerations, and these are things which very much rule our lives as the beekeepers that we are: the location of hives and the numbers that are appropriate for that location, the forage for the new hives and opportunities to plant more for them, and the impact on the wider local environment. Are they beneficial? And if so, beneficial how? Are they the correct species or subspecies of bee for that location? And do we understand that locality, the honeybee health and welfare issues that pertain in that particular area? So if we can just go on to the next slide, there's another core word, and that is knowledge. If we're going to be sustainable beekeepers, we have to have knowledge. We cannot wing it. You might have been able to once upon a time learn about beekeeping as you went along, consider it job done if you'd done your basic beekeeping training. It's not enough anymore. The foundation of sustainable beekeeping anywhere is knowledge. So you need training and you need continuing mentorship, because things change and there are always going to be people more experienced than you. So it's a question of lifelong learning, and it's a question of following science, not sentiment. We must balance economic aspirations with the environmental realities. And we must see our mistakes and apply that learning, because nature isn't static. Everything changes all the time, and knowledge equips us as beekeepers to see that change and respond appropriately. And I would also say that good beekeepers keep good records, because that allows you to collect data which you can then apply. You can look back and you can see where things are going well, going badly, and you're building a picture of the environment in which your bees are living. So let's just have the next slide. So I'm going to, just in these next two slides, I'm going to compare what we're doing, how sustainable and appropriate works for us in the UK, and then we're going to look at elements of Bees Abroad's practice. So for us, hive location, we have town and country hives, and there's numerous considerations for us around the appropriate siting. Currently, we have around 90 hives across 14 locations, so that's very low density of hives per location. We're very careful where we site them, and we have taken, every time we've actually had the opportunity to expand our hive holding dramatically, we've decided not to. We've decided to remain very small and very specialist. Bee welfare above honey production, always, and building long-term health into our colonies. We want them to overwinter well. We want them to have all the honey that they need. We also will plant knowledgeably, and you know, there's planting and there's planting. You've got to plant the right things if you're going to do what we call green offset, the impact of our hives, and then you'd be planting other things to improve local forage environment. And in order to be able to plant around hives, when we had central London hives, we had to beg, borrow and steal space, but it worked, and it was fine. We built a lot of community gardens, and they brought a lot to the environment. Again, only local bees. We breed our own queens. We only have bees that actually belong to the place where that apiary is. Record keeping, very, very important, learning and applying data. Lifelong training. Again, you know, you just keep on and on learning. Sensitivity to change and responding in time. Writing and speaking, as I'm doing now. I'm sharing our experience. I'm not saying we're perfect. I'm not saying we've got the answer to everything. What I'm doing is literally sharing with you the experience that we've had and the conclusions that we've come to along the way, to try and, you know, continuously improve our practice. And we really depend on other people to help us, to give us reflections. So we have great relationships with ecologists, with wildlife experts, and with greening charities. Those are part of our support system in making us better beekeepers. And then finally, in terms of you know, close to home and sustainability, things like running our business on green energy, paying fair wages, sourcing from local suppliers, working towards zero waste, they all count. You know, they're part of the whole story. So then if we then have the next slide, and we look at Bees Abroad's practice, and it'll be interesting because there are some really, you know, core themes that translate across from what we do and what Bees Abroad are doing. So the beekeeping programs on the projects are tailored to people's needs and to the local environment. Changing honey hunters into beekeepers. This is something that is so important. We've just been in Cambodia looking at the shocking decline of Apis dorsata. And, you know, you can sit and study it until you're blue in the face, but you don't actually, until you land on the ground, see how big the problem is and the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is that the culture in Cambodia has never actually evolved from honey hunting into beekeeping, and that they are literally eating the dorsata grubs and all. They have no sense that they have to conserve the dorsata nests, and it's a disaster what's happened there. So it's really important, if you can actually move into away from honey hunting and into beekeeping, that can have a really, really positive effect on biodiversity, on maintaining biodiversity. Hives built by village carpenters and populated by natural colonization, with native bees that belong to that environment. So not importing bees and not leaving people with kit that doesn't make any sense for them to use. And then you have this wonderful mentoring and support against lifelong learning. And beyond that, the planting. So we're planting stuff for our bees here. That the plantings are even more meaningful because they're feeding the bees, they're boosting the local ecology, and they're also augmenting cash crops. They're providing cash crops in the long term, and long term is really vital as part of the story. The other thing that I'm so impressed about when I was talking to Bees Abroad was that it's set up as a very, very sustainable economy. So it's not dependent on honey and wax necessarily. There's a lot of associated crafts, there's village banking schemes. So again, what you're looking at them building and what we're trying to build in our practice is something that is robust, that has longevity, and that has as much positive impact as one can possibly build into it. So if we could have the last slide, just summing up what the takeaways are from what I've been talking about. So increasingly, as beekeepers anywhere, we need to have environmental awareness, we need really good training, and we need a commitment to lifelong learning. We all need to get that honeybees are not going extinct, and that beekeepers also need to understand and work within the bigger ecological picture. Otherwise, we're just laying ourselves open to the accusations of being careless and of just crowding out the wild bees in some areas. And yes, they do. We accept that honeybees do have the potential to disrupt local ecology. They can change the flora and fauna. So they can be weaponized, and we need to recognize that. But we also should end on the lovely upbeat note that if sustainably and appropriately handled, beekeeping is a wonderful thing, and it can make multiple positive contributions to people's lives and to the environment as well. If I could have the next slide, please, which is a shameful bit of personal promotion. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, if anybody's interested in following more about plantings for bees, then on Instagram you'll find me at Planting for the Bees. And if you're more interested in the honey side of things, you'll find me at Honey Sommelier London. The Wild Bee Handbook, which is the book on the right, is my new book. When I wrote Planting for Honeybees in 2018, it still did seem as if we were looking at honeybee stocks being sort of facially depleted in some areas. So it has a lot of information about honeybees and about what we can plant specifically to help honeybees. The Wild Bee Handbook looks at those other 24,900 and whatever it is species that we also need to be very aware of. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope that I haven't upset anyone with anything that I've said. I hope that it's realistic, that it shows that it is possible to do the right thing and to be a beekeeper and to enjoy the pleasure that bees can bring to us all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. I'm sure everyone will have a lot of questions. I certainly have questions for you. But in terms of the format, I think I forgot to mention that at the beginning. We'll be moving on to Adam's talk now, and then we'll do a short bit about Bees Abroad's work, just building on some of what Sarah said. And then we'll go into a Q&A section. So the Bees Abroad people will be, including myself, will be monitoring the chat for questions. So if they pop into your head, put them into the chat so you don't forget them. I certainly thought of 3 questions, and now I'm sat here and I can only think of one. So I wish I'd put them into the chat as I was going. Yes, handing over to Adam. I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully Adam can share his.
I'll have a go. It's okay. Can you see?
Yay.
Yes.
All right. Although it's not actually. There we go. It works. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here. My talk follows on. I'm sort of sat here listening to Sarah's talk, and a huge number of the themes that she's spoken about in terms of honeybees, I'm going to be picking up on. first of all with honeybees, but secondly, with another group of bees, which were also mentioned in Sarah's talk, the stingless bees. So there's quite a lot of interesting crossovers between the two. So I'm talking about the fall and then the problematic rise of stingless bees and stingless beekeeping in Mexico. And I was last out in this area about 20 years ago. And when I came back, I was giving quite a few talks about stingless bees. And I was talking about their dramatic decline and the fact that nobody wanted to keep them. And 2 decades on, things have changed somewhat. And it's quite interesting to look at how those changes have taken place, but also the problems that they've created, which really echo some of the problems that Sarah's talking about, and some of the solutions to those problems, which again are not dissimilar. So let's have a little start. So the area that I'm talking about, I'm sure many of you know your geography, but I'm used to talking to groups of students, and I've noticed that some people's geography isn't quite so good as others. So just so we're all on the same page, I'm talking really about the stingless bees of Mexico, which is the country immediately south of the United States. And in particular, I'm talking about the Yucatan Peninsula, where a great deal of beekeeping goes on, actually both apis and Melipona, or stingless bees, centered around the sort of capital here of Merida. And about, well, close to 20 years ago now, I think it was about 2004, 2005, I took a trip along with Claire Waring for Bees Abroad down to the Yucatan with a large, decent number of Bees Abroad supporters and beekeepers. And we went around the area looking at both apis and stingless beekeeping. So there's a bit of a Bees Abroad link there as well. And the kind of general sort of plan that I want to follow here is to look at sort of traditional beekeeping in this area, because traditional beekeeping in this area was all about stingless bees, which Sarah mentioned earlier, and I'll give a little intro to in a moment. It's known as Melipona culture as opposed to apiculture, because one of the dominant genera is Melipona, and it's a very traditional form of beekeeping that dates back before the Spanish came and before European influence there, and is actually deeply embedded in the Mayan culture of the whole region. So beekeeping is incredibly important historically to this area. And if you go and visit many of these archaeological sites that part of Mexico is very famous for, you will find many references within the sites to beekeeping. And you can find many references in what few historical documents the Spanish didn't burn to beekeeping as well. So it's quite a sort of deep-seated part of the culture in this area. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about modern beekeeping, because modern beekeeping has largely displaced traditional beekeeping, particularly about 2 decades ago. But now we've started to see a rise again. And one of the reasons that we've seen that rise is the problems that we've seen with apiculture, with apis, in particular, the problems that were caused by Africanization. So this is the sort of the breeding of killer bees as they become known in popular culture, Africanized bees spreading up from Brazil with they're very aggressive bees. They have a very low threshold for anger and a very high tendency to come and sting. And I've been under attack from Africanized bees, and it's not a lot of fun, I can tell you. I was in an open-sided sort of Volkswagen Combi, for old vehicle aficionados among you, and the guy was saying, don't worry, they'll only chase us 500 meters. And they didn't. They chased us about 2.5 kilometers down the road. They'll never find the hive again. It's a terrible adaptation for them, but they were incredibly aggressive. And if we hadn't have had bee suits on and in a vehicle, we would have been in a huge amount of trouble. And people do die, and those bees do kill people, not in significant numbers in parts of Southern and South America, particularly in the past. So Africanization was a major problem, which we'll come back to. But just to give us a little bit of sort of zoological kind of background, what we're talking about when we're talking about bumblebees, honeybees, and stingless bees, and also a group called the orchid bees, are the so-called corbiculate bees. And the corbiculae that they're referring to are these pollen basket structures that are so familiar to those of us that watch honeybees. And also this time of year, the big bumblebees bimbling around, you can often see them wearing these kind of trousers where they keep the pollen. And it's those corbiculae, the pollen baskets, that give this group their name. And these are the bees. Of course, there's the honeybees up there, and then we've got the bumblebees, which are quite familiar to most of you, I'm sure. We've got the stingless bees, and then we've also got the orchid bees. Now, the orchid bees are solitary, more or less. They're fascinating. They do all kinds of cool things, but for the purposes of this talk, we won't mention them further. But they nearly all have this beautiful metallic look. But we're interested really in the stingless bees, which are essentially a sister group to the more familiar honeybees and bumblebees. And as Sarah mentioned, there's about 450 or 500 species of these across the world. They should be far better known than they are, but they're only found in the tropics. And I think that's one of the reasons why we generally don't see them very often. You very rarely even see them covered on nature documentaries and things either, despite them being quite common. But that's their kind of stamping ground across the tropics. And I mentioned earlier how they're very important historically for beekeeping within Central and South America, but they're also very important over in Malaysia and Northern Australia. And indeed in parts of tropical Africa, but that's their main areas where they're kept. But you can find these species all the way through the tropics of the world. Much more diverse, not just in terms of numbers. So obviously there's many more species than there are, but also in terms of the way they go about doing things and the number of genera within those groups. They are an incredibly diverse group. And the diversity is expressed both in how they look, their appearance, their size. I mean, some of them are barely bigger than a fruit fly. You can see this one down here being mounted, I mean, impaled would be a better word for it, I think, on this entomological pin. That is a very fine pin. That is a very small bee. And then some are about the size of honeybees and a little bit larger, but they're also diverse in terms of their behavior, their nest structure, even what they collect. Some of them collect feces, some of them collect carrion. Incredible range of different behaviors within the group, which for me as a biologist makes them fascinating. And I'm constantly amazed that they're not better known than they are. But you know, that is the nature of the beast, isn't it? Honeybees, as we've heard earlier, tend to absorb everybody's bee kind of love, and we forget about the 19,993 other species and counting. And they're very, very diverse, and they are fascinating creatures. In terms of the nest inside, they're a kind of mix between, which sort of was what you'd expect from them, where they sort of sit evolutionarily, but they're a kind of mix between bumblebees and honeybees. They have the nice, regular arranged combs of honeybees, although they're generally horizontal. So you can see them sort of over here on the right-hand side. But even that has diversity, because sometimes they'll make spiral combs, which is quite something to see. And then there are a few species that decide to do something different, and they make combs like bunches of grapes. So that's where they rear their brood. And unlike honeybees, they rear them in closed cells. So they provision the cell, they lay the egg, or the queen lays the egg, and they seal it over. So they don't constantly feed the developing larvae. But lots and lots of different nest sort of structures. Here is the main bee that I'm talking about in the Yucatan. And this is Melipona beechii, a little bit smaller than a honeybee. More delicately proportioned, I think, but also sort of slightly finer kind of striping and line. I'm a bit biased, but I think they're quite a beautiful looking bee, actually. I rather like Melipona. They are stingless, which means they don't sting you. That doesn't mean that they're defenseless, though, and they will sort of crawl all over you, and they pluck hairs and get into your ears and stuff. They can be incredibly annoying, actually, but they won't sting you. So, and they're generally trying to, they're normally much more defensive in terms of the structure of their nest. They like to be inside small cavities with very small entrance holes. So this is what a typical nest will look like. Here is the stack of brood comb over here. And then there's all kinds of sort of involucrum here around the outside, which is a kind of waxy membrane that they made up. They often mix it with resin, make a form of propolis, or they'll mix it with even sort of mud and things like that to make a slightly stronger structure. So that's the brood area. And then to the left in this particular nest, you've got these storage pots, which are very reminiscent of bumblebee nests if you've looked inside. Very, very similar sort of setup. And it's in these storage pots that they'll store both pollen and nectar, which they will convert into honey. So although these are tropical species, I think a lot of people think of the tropics as being aseasonal. Well, they're not, but they're certainly not aseasonal when it comes to flower and nectar availability. So these bees need to be able to tide themselves over, particularly, Sarah mentioned earlier, in periods of heavy rain and so on, which are frequent occurrence during wet seasons. So they do produce honey, and that honey is a storage product, and we can, of course, go and harvest that, which doesn't feel too bad when you're harvesting a Melipona beechii colony. I'll show you in a moment where they produce a reasonable amount of honey. You can actually harvest the honey from those tiny little bees that are about the size of fruit flies, and you can sort of pull it out with a syringe and things, which, to be honest, just feels a bit like stealing at that stage. But you can gather the honey up from here. Either side of it, by the way, the nest within the cavity, they'll build this bitumen plate. That stuff is like concrete. It's basically a mix of propolis and mud. and it bakes in the heat. And you try and get through that, you're looking at sort of cold chisels and stuff. It's unbelievable that it feels like it's rock, some of these batumen plates. So they're quite well put together, these colonies. But of course, if you've got a colony inside a hollow branch like that with batumen plates either side, it's really very simple to simply saw off either side, and you've got yourself a log hive. The problem is, of course, you're also destroying a fairly big chunk of tree whilst you're doing it. But if you do that, you can remove the colony and you can put them in boxes. We'll see later that these bees don't fare particularly well in boxes, but this is a Melipona beechii colony. This is actually a laboratory study colony, and you can recreate the nest inside here quite easily. You can have your honey area over here and your combs and so on, and then you can seal them in with in this case, a glass plate was put on the top so that we could observe what was going on. Very docile to work with. You can remove the glass plate. They don't rise up. They don't behave really like honeybees at all, which you could argue is a problem for them when honeybees come onto their turf. So that's the sort of honeycomb just being removed there. And there's the queen. Quite interesting in many of these species, the queen is actually smaller than the workers, just in head size and overall abdomen and thorax. But in order to accommodate her ovaries, she actually plasticizes her cuticle and expands it, rather like you've probably seen termites and things like that. Some of the ants do this as well. So you have a smaller queen, but she's capable of expanding herself. And this one is a young queen that's still in the process of expansion. She'll get a little bit bigger than that. But you can see even in this image here that the queen's head is actually substantially smaller than the workers, equally the thorax too. It's quite an interesting bit of biology for them. I mentioned earlier how ingrained into culture these bees are. In fact, the mayor had a god, a honeybee god. This is Almuntzenkab, and it's portrayed here, this god, actually descending to earth. These are his kind of legs up here. So he's sort of diving down. He's one of the descending gods of the mayor, and that's bringing us things from the heavens. And what Almuntzenkab is bringing us is actually the comb here of stingless bees. And the ears of Almuntzenkab here, I'm just losing my pointer, just here, the ears are actually what the end of log hives look like when you stuff a sort of round disc of wood in there to seal them up. So this is, and you can see images of Almuntzenkab even now around in the Yucatan. People will wear t-shirts with them on. I've bought coffee in a coffee shop that had Almuntzenkab on the cups. It's a fairly common deity to see around the place. Here's a log hive, by the way. Some of these are beautiful. This hive I found against the back of someone's bee yard. I was just rooting around. I was actually looking for scorpions, and I was rooting around and found this one. And it's beautiful. This was probably, I mean, we couldn't date it, but it was comfortably over 100 years old. And someone had spent a lot of time depicting. This was Izamal Cathedral, which was just around a corner. And this is actually a bee that's being depicted very much like Almuntzenkab, with the sort of legs in the air. So it's kind of reflecting the sort of god of bees and beekeeping. Now, people particularly in the Yucatan, but also in other parts of Mexico, used to keep these log hives in huge numbers. This photograph was taken at the beginning of the 20th century, so sometime around 1905, 1910. And there are huge numbers of hives in here, well over 500, and they're in these open palapa structures, and this would have been a common sight around the area. They used to be kept in very, very large numbers. Smaller numbers now. This photograph was taken around about the early 80s, and this would have been a very large bee yard for that time. You can see, by the way, the end of the log hives there, looking like the earrings of Almuntzenkab earlier. And when I went out in 2000, 2001, 2002, we were looking for beekeepers, traditional beekeepers that were keeping Melipona. And this guy was the biggest within the area. And we had to travel 50 kilometers to find him. And he had 10 hives. And then we had to travel another 30 kilometers to find the second biggest. And he had 7 hives. It was a tiny fragment left. A few people had a few, very few people had more than a handful, and Venancio here in his bee yard was the only really substantial keeper of Melipona within a drivable day's distance of Merida. Quite staggering, really. And he was, when we arrived, he was actually doing a honey harvest, which he allowed us to watch, which was relatively undramatic, actually. No protective gear necessary. Chip away the end of the hive. His only kit, a sieve, in order to strain off any bees that had got into the honey, but very, very low tech, very straightforward. And you simply remove parts of the colony you don't want. If you open up the wrong end, you pierce those honey pots, and then you pour the honey out. Very easy, very straightforward, very safe. The problem is also incredibly inefficient in terms of honey production. Very, very limited yield, but beautiful honey. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of honey generally. I realize I'm in the wrong room for this, but it's not necessarily, but this is really nice. And it's much more, it has much higher water content than Apis honey, and yet doesn't spoil. And lots of biochemists and things are very interested in the properties of this, and have been over the last couple of decades, particularly with wound healing and so on coming to the fore. So that type of honey can be harvested relatively easily. It has all kinds of putative health benefits. Benancier was, as beekeepers are wont to do, was extolling the virtues of it a little too much. He told me that it could cure leukemia and kidney cancer and all sorts of other things. But there seemed to be some well-supported, at least anecdotal evidence at the time, for cataract, skin infections, leg ulcer wounds, respiratory infections, and so on. But it's also used as a sweetener, and it's traditionally been used as a drink, either dolce, which is an alcoholic drink, or something called sake, which is mixed with corn, blended corn, and it's given especially to women, and it's particularly given to women who have just given birth, and it's a very traditional part of sort of the use of honey in that area. Benancier actually died in 2003. He wasn't sure how old he was when we met him, so I don't know how old he was at that stage, but yeah, he was, with his passing, went a substantial amount of local knowledge, but also a substantial quantity of the number of captive hives. And I'm not sure what happened to his hives afterwards. I know a few of them were given to the other beekeeper, but presumably the rest ended up in various sort of probably Apis bee yards around the place. So why did melipona culture go from being this incredibly important thing to being basically almost dead? Well, the first reason was when the Spanish arrived, they did an awful lot of forest clearing. And that was for a number of reasons. It was to produce towns, and it was to allow the production of sort of cattle and so on, but it was also to get rid of people from the countryside and stick them in cities and towns so that they could be controlled. The Spanish had a huge problem conquering and settling this area. And once they were in, they weren't going to fall for it twice. So there was an awful lot of forest clearance that went on for that. And then they also, in the 18th and 19th century, started clearing what was remaining of the forest for sisal production and henequen, which is agave. So it's used for at that stage for making fibers for sisal rope. The reason why sisal rope is called sisal rope, by the way, is that the port in the Yucatan, where it was exported from, was called Sisal. And as the bales went through, they were stamped with a big thing saying Sisal to show where they were from. But obviously, by the time it got to Europe, it looked like that was what it was called. So that's where the name comes from. So lots and lots of forest clearance went on to produce this type of crop. But the really big problem for stingless bees was the introduction in 1911 of Apis mellifera. Apis mellifera is a far better honey producer than melipona. It's a superior wax, pollen, and propolis producer. You can do proper beekeeping, if you like, in hives. They don't mind it. In fact, they seem to thrive if you get it set up properly. There's a good export market. And around about World War II, a very large trading company in New York invested heavily in the area in exchange for exclusive rights to Yucatan honey. And so honeybees ballooned in the area. Everybody got into honeybee keeping because it was the only game in town. And there were other problems too. Melipona honey internationally wasn't recognized as honey. It wasn't recognized as a foodstuff by the Codex Alimentarius, which made it very difficult to export. Very low yield, inefficient traditional techniques, which have got very, very limited appeal to a more sophisticated younger generation. No real export market. The national market dwindled considerably as people moved away and didn't really understand what these stingless bee kind of products were. The supply of it's not just small, but also unreliable. And, you know, relatively controversial, but I don't think so after Sarah's laid the ground here. Melipona is simply outcompeted by Apis, and you can sit by flowers and watch it happen. Apis, Melipona will be there bimbling around, and Apis will come in and throw it off. And I've seen it many, many times. Also, and one of the reasons why I enjoyed studying them so much is that they don't really start doing anything until about 9:30, 10 in the morning. And they usually finish around 4:30 Melipona. They've got a very short foraging day, very kind of nice rhythm. You know, if you like to have a few sundowners and things, it's great. Apis, on the other hand, is up at the crack of dawn and it's out working those flowers all day long. And they really do just hammer it in. So they're much better in terms of honey production. Advantages, though, of stingless bees: very low financial investment, very easy and safe beekeeping. There is clearly the potential for some lucrative niche marketing, and also, and this is, you know, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, but it's a traditional technique, and a lot of people like to throw back to that. You know, it takes a while for people to move from thinking, oh, it's all old hat, to actually, oh, I'm really interested in doing things the old way. So there's some interesting sort of things that have happened. But yeah, around about 20 years ago, beginning of the 2000s, stingless beekeeping was basically found in a few areas of the Yucatan and just up here north of Mexico City. That was it. But since then, I'm sorry, I'm just going to need to move this a little bit so I can see what's going on. Since then, we have seen a rise in Melipona culture over the last 20 years. The Africanization of bees made small-scale apiculture very difficult and dangerous. You didn't want to have 2 or 3 hives in your back garden, or 10 hives, when you've got kids around and you've got neighbors and you've got people that could get killed. And so what happened with beekeeping generally was that larger apiaries out of town became where beekeeping was done. Now, that was great for bigger beekeepers, but it wasn't so good for smaller scale people that just wanted to keep a few bees. That opened up a niche during that period for stingless bees, because suddenly you've got people interested in beekeeping that can't keep Africanized bees in their back gardens, in an urban area, in an area of a village where there's lots of people around. So that was a big niche that was created. All female projects also started to increase rapidly as women in villages would get collectively into keeping Melipona rather than Apis. And there was also, at the same time, a rise of interest in Melipona products. Things like pollen, propolis, honey mixes, wax, which is known as cera de Campeche, which was very desirable by some people, tinctures and supplements and all kinds of other bits and pieces, suddenly developed into a bit of a market, in part because of a market that was started to develop, I think, in Brazil, where some of these products were taking hold as well. And that started to get people thinking about that local market, not just honey, but suddenly these value-added products appealing to people who want to go into health food stores, for example, and purchase things for generally quite large sums of money. So there was suddenly some profit to be made. Of course, all of this came with a few problems. One of which is that during this period, the demand for colonies began to outstrip the supply. And what that meant was that people went out into the wider world and started effectively poaching wild colonies. I mean, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, I'm assuming, but they were going into forests, cutting down and removing colonies. And that's the first problem. They were trying to keep with this demand. The second problem is that historically, really only 2 species were kept: Melipona beechi here and Scaptodragona mexicana. Other species were kept in very small numbers, kind of as a sort of, you know, a novelty. But those were the 2 predominant species. Well, now what we see is 16 species being kept because there's not enough of the good ones, if you like. People are now keeping all kinds of things like Nanotrigona and various Trigona species, and they're really extending out. Now, that's great, and people are interested in it, brilliant, but all of those are being supplied by wild-caught colonies. And that's not good news for wild-caught colonies, particularly because many of those wild colonies are under pressure from Apis. Lots of other problems too. You know, some of the species don't fare well in artificial setups. Most of them, or many of them, will always die if you try and put them in boxes because they can't thermoregulate. Many of the people interested in it, and this really echoes some of the things Sarah was saying, many of the people interested in it have poor husbandry and very low skill base to begin with. Incorrect use of pest control is a major problem. People are introducing these little vinegar traps to capture phorid flies which parasitize them, but actually, if you don't do it right, you attract them, which is bad news. If you feed colonies syrup, that generally attracts Apis, which rob out the Melipona. If you feed them Apis pollen to try and supplement them, it will cause disease. If you do put them in a hive, they generally never do well because there's no real research into good hive design. And guess what? Social media and forums massively exacerbate these problems, as there's this kind of, perpetuation of poor information to do with this. On top of that, moving colonies from different areas, and remember, we've got this sort of historical hotbed of kind of activity, and it's now spreading out through southern Mexico. Moving them around causes genetic issues. It interrupts local adaptations. Bees that are adapted over multiple generations to thrive in a particular area are suddenly put in a different area with different timing of floral blooms and different flowers and so on. There is a possibility of hybridizing these species, which is problematic. And all over, we've seen a reduction in genetic diversity. There's also the potential for some of these species to become locally invasive and to increase competition with local species that may be doing poorly as well. So in a sense, they're replicating the problems of Apis before. So what can be done? Well, very, very similar to what Sarah was talking about, actually, data collection. We need more information. We need better record keeping. We need more data being put through, and we need more collation of that data. We need more courses and certifications so that you can't just go and get a colony and do what you want with it. You need to have some skills here. Validated information being transferred through respected channels, actually having some proper information on how to keep these, being accessible in a respected way so that you don't get these social media kind of echo chambers of doom for those particular species. People are talking about running awareness campaigns so that people become aware of the fact that their little hobby bee yard outside is actually causing a problem. There needs to be regulation of wild colony collection. Currently, there's no protection from them. People are talking about what sort of legal penalties can be brought in for collecting bees from the wild. We need to regulate colony movement, and we need more research into colony management. And I guess reflecting what Sarah mentioned earlier, and actually I first heard this comment from John Chappell on that trip 20 years ago to the Yucatan. What we need isn't more beekeepers, and what we need, and we can put Apis or Melipona in front of there. What we need is better beekeepers, and that really is the case. Now, I find it quite incredible, really, that over a relatively short time frame, it's less than 20 years, actually, it's more like 17 years. The situation's changed from there's no Melipona around, it's a dying art, there's no one interested in it. And now 17 years on, there's too many people interested in it. We need better regulation. It's incredible how fast these things can shift. But I think as beekeepers, all of us, or people interested in this, all of us have a responsibility to be responsible. And that now is a transitional period that people in Mexico are going through in response to this kind of rise in Melipona culture as well. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to just stop sharing now, and I will mute myself and then go and close the door, which one of my children's just opened, and be back shortly.
Fantastic, thank you, Adam. So a few more moments to think of questions, and we'll just do a bit about our work here. So Sarah mentioned a couple of the ways in which we work, and the kind of holistic approach of appropriate, I guess, fit for purpose beekeeping in the areas that we work in, which includes things like planting native bee-friendly species to provide sufficient forage for those bees, but also on the I guess more the human side of things and the sustainability of keeping a hive, which there's a whole, I guess, supply chain around that, including bee suits, so having those locally made, using local craftsmen to make hives and such things like that. And Sarah also mentioned a bit in her talk about bees used for crop pollination, industrial crop pollination, but also smallholder crop pollination. Our blog just came out yesterday on the bee and the bean, on how beekeeping and sustainable farming, sustainable beekeeping and sustainable farming can be mutually reinforcing. So if you're interested in that, that's on our website. There's a couple of ways you can support us if you've enjoyed this. I always say if you've enjoyed it as much as a pint, if you're in London, that's probably about £6. Or perhaps even a trip to the cinema with popcorn, which these days is probably about £15. Or if you're feeling very generous, there's no upper limit. So there's a donate QR code there, and there'll also be a link in a follow-up email. We also have a prize draw open, so that's a way to donate and be in with a chance of winning some amazing prizes, including a night stay for 2 in a 5-star hotel. So a couple of options there. And I won't speak too much longer because I think there's lots of questions. I can see the chat getting busy. So we'll start on the Q&A section. I'll just leave this screen up. And just have a quick look through here now. I did see one come through during Sarah's talk. Actually, I hope I'm saying it right, Jitesh had 2 questions. The first was on BBKA modules and their inclusion of sustainability or lack of, and your thoughts and reflections on that. And then a second question. Actually, we'll go with that one first, and yeah, and then we'll move on to the next because there might be some discussion on that.
I feel very strongly that some BKAs are fantastically good at the training that they're giving people right from day one. We've worked with, I would name Twickenham beekeepers particularly as one who, they're really trying to give the broadest possible education to their young trainee beekeepers. But the modules, so the basic and stuff, they're not really looking at some of the bigger issues early enough, I feel. And Dale is just literally in the last stages of working towards being master beekeeper at the moment. And it's really interesting seeing the progression of the amount of work he's putting in to things like disease and stuff. It's a huge commitment, but I think it's one that he's feeling very willing to make because he knows that it will make him a better beekeeper. Now, you're talking about someone who's now a really very experienced beekeeper, and we've had a lot of young beekeepers who we've taken along with us on our journey and then sent them off to do their training with to go and take their basic as well. So we're very pro people doing those modules, but I think that they could do with revising certainly some of the earlier stuff, because as I say, when I do often talk to BKAs, I'm very surprised by some of the questions from people who are in theory quite experienced, and again it's this narrow vision of I've got my bees and they're the best thing in the world, and we all feel that about our bees. I feel that about my dogs as well, sometimes my children, but we have to look at things through a wider scope if we're to defend ourselves as a body of people against what are now really quite hot and heavy accusations of damaging the environment through our beekeeping. And if we're not equipped to do that, then I feel that we're possibly being failed by some of the early stage learning. So that's my feeling about it. It needs a little bit of work on those modules.
Great, thank you. Just I guess related to that, and some countries taking dramatic steps in banning bees or trying to eradicate honeybees. I got a question on whether the same is happening or what's happening in Mexico around the explosion of I'm not sure I can pronounce it properly.
Or Apis. That's Adam, really. You're the person who aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Mexico, so there was a big study that was done very recently. I drew a lot of that information from the back end of that talk from, which is starting to lay down some guidelines, but nothing's really formally being done yet. But there's definitely a movement towards bringing these things in. But in terms of Apis, no, it's a huge business in the Yucatan. There's about 41,000 honey producers. I'm just reading from this latest report here, with 2 million hives and a profit in export of $56 million and rising. So this is big business. The Yucatan is a major exporter of honey, and it's a major source of income for many people across the region. So yeah, there's certainly nothing being done in terms of apis. In terms of trying to get some regulation for melipona, I imagine it will be quite slow. It's fairly low down the agenda, I think, for a lot of Mexican sort of politics. But there are people starting to push and move towards it now, and we're starting to get some studies that back it up and starting to lay down some guidelines. So I guess watch this space. You know, in 17 years' time, maybe I'll be sort of coming on here and saying, right, things have changed now, and it's the fall, the rise, and then the fall again, or at least the controlled and regulation of melipona. But yeah, at the moment, it's just continuing as it was.
Mm. We have another question about the situation in Mexico and whether the hybridized African bees attack the stingless bees.
No more than normal. They don't really attack them so much as displace them on flowers and so on, and they will also rob them, but no more so than other bees. The main issue with them really is just they have a very low threshold for deciding to attack, and when they attack, they will then just all pile in. They chase for much longer. They'll rise out of a hive much quicker. So the main problem is for people, and also for themselves, of course, because they will all commit suicide effectively. I've seen some demonstrations where people put little nodding sort of dogs, little soft toy kind of dogs outside of hives, and sort of have a big hammer that knocks on the side of the hive, and I mean those things will collect hundreds and hundreds of stings within 20 or 30 seconds. They are quite incredible when they get going. That is a problem. Actually, themselves have a problem in the area from army ants, which is a main predator of honeybee colonies. And now, if you go to the Yucatan, you'll find everyone that keeps bees keeps them in these kind of concrete forms that they make, which are like a trough with a sort of a post in the middle, and they'll put the hive on the top of there, and then they fill the trough with kind of sump oil and stuff like that, which stops the army ants from getting in. So they have their own sort of issues there, but once they're in the right location and put together, then what you're finding with a lot of, because of the Africanization, I mean, certainly what I saw out there, in the beginning of the 2000s, was that people had gone from beekeeping in their shirt sleeves, and I mean, almost literally an onion bag over their head as a veil. They're not really that bothered, and now they've got to go in full kit and gloves and everything else, and obviously that's quite difficult in an area that's very hot, and you need to tank your kit somewhere, which is why you end up with these sort of collective apiaries a long way out. You've got people driving in and all sorts of stuff. So it changed, I suppose. It industrialized it to a certain extent, which of course opened this niche for melipona. But no, in terms of sort of interactions, there doesn't seem to be any difference between them and sort of regular honeybees, if you like, and all the bees and all the honeybees in those areas now are Africanized to some extent.
So there is that kind of cross breeding between species in the area, is there?
I know that. So the Africanized honeybee is just a strain essentially of honeybee that was produced in South America and then very rapidly expanded up through and interbred with, if you like, the honeybees. Well, they weren't native, the non-native resident honeybees in those different areas, but the Africanization, the process of making them more aggressive, spread up through very, very, very quickly. It ultimately is self-defeating when honeybee colonies are too aggressive, and so there's been selection for less and less aggression, but nonetheless most of the bees there are significantly and substantially more aggressive than you would expect from sort of European, used to keeping sort of more docile bees. Although that said, I've been in people's bee yards with allegedly docile bees in this country. I gotta say that's not always the case, but yeah, they're substantially more aggressive overall.
Right, but no further interbreeding between the species.
No, apis won't interbreed with melipona, so they're very but there are species of stingless bee which are close enough that they're fearful of hybridization between them, but no, not with honeybees.
Okay, interesting. Got a question from Simon. Are there guidelines for hive spacing to prevent disease spreading in rural tropical areas? Thinking about what was said in problems in urban areas, is there a risk of that happening in urban areas? There is a risk of happening in rural areas if the rural areas suddenly become, I guess, a popular place to keep bees, if that makes sense. I think I might be butchering that question.
Well, I'm sure Sarah's got some thoughts on that as well, but a quick thought in terms of Mexico. One of the issues of suddenly having bigger apiaries out of town, sort of collectivized in that way, was to bring colonies together, and that's always an issue when it comes to disease spread. And you were talking about migratory beekeeping earlier. Well, one of the big problems with that is that in California, for the Central Valley almond harvesting, you've got beekeepers from all over the country bringing, trailers. I mean, hundreds of hives, some of these people. I mean, even a small fry beekeeper in America might have over 1,000 hives, and they all come together, and then they put them all in one place, and then they spread them out again. And it would be hard to write a better recipe for disease spread than that type of beekeeping. So yeah, that's always an issue. But in terms of guidelines, I'm not sure. Do you know of any? Sarah?
No, I don't. I mean, I think a lot of the problem is humans' fundamental greed.
Yeah.
Really, it's hard to avoid that being the baseline problem. And where there is plenty apparently for bees, then people will pile in. We have friends who are beekeepers in Berlin, and Berlin's a lovely green city, and they've got Tempelhof, and they've got all sorts of wonderful areas. But when the lime trees come into flower, the linden, then they have country beekeepers bringing their hives into Berlin and dumping them there. And of course, they get pretty fed up with it. So I think, the problem is somewhat of a lack of common sense. The world can't bear too many, of any one species congregated in one place artificially, and that goes exactly back to what you're talking about the migratory beekeeping in America, which is a truly terrifying sight. We've seen the road trains, and the losses are quite unreal. And you're looking at bees being used as a sort of effectively a machine to provide pollination for something that is grown in a chemical soup anyway in California, and then sold in health food shops for a lot of money. So there's so many faulty mechanisms at play in our relationship with bees, and so many points at which if we stood back and looked at it, we'd say that is clearly wrong. But when did that stop humans doing anything? It really didn't.
Yeah. I put a link in the chat there. I went out to California in 2012 to talk to people about migratory beekeeping for a Radio 4 doc, and it was staggering. I went to a place where he called it his nuking zone, and it basically brought hives in on a conveyor belt, and then he had a Y-shaped conveyor belt that came off basically, and they brought the hives in, they pulled out all the frames, they made two, they had queens there lined up. This guy was unbelievable at grafting them. Bang, it went on down the conveyor belt, and they're literally, creating from 2,000 hives. They'll create 4,000 hives, and they're doing that across an afternoon. It's beekeeping on a scale that I don't think people can quite believe. Some of these beekeepers are keeping so many hives. I worked out that if I was overtaking the biggest beekeeper in America that went down to the Central Valley, if he had all of his bees on a convoy going at 50 kilometers an hour and I overtook at 60, it would take me the best part of 20 minutes to get past him. It's staggering. I mean, I spoke to one guy, he'd had a semi-trailer, as they call it, an Arctic basically, that tipped on a mountain pass, and they just had hives everywhere. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I went to the local farm and borrowed a dozer, and we just reefed them over the side. He said, and then I set light to them.
I mean,
so that's how they treat them.
That's fitting. Is exactly why there is no blip shown over colony collapse.
Yeah.
In that relentless rise of hive numbers that's been in the UN figures, which are always surprising to people, because every newspaper you open, every radio thing you listen to, every box that's being rattled is saying, let's save honeybees because they're going extinct.
Yeah.
I think, golly, can we just start from fact one, which is that they're not, and that they are abused mightily by humans if they're kept in the sort of conditions we're describing, where they're just split and split and split, and you can discard millions of bees more or less without looking back. I find it horrifying. I really do find it horrifying, but it's a fact of life.
Yeah, and 85% of the world's almonds are grown in the Central Valley, and everyone relies on a honeybee to pollinate it. And almonds are found in a surprising array of produce. You know, most people have probably eaten them today, and yeah, we're all complicit in that. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I actually have another question, but just a quick one on, we've got a few more things coming up in our green story, which runs till World Bee Day on the 20th of May. So if you want to see more of Sarah and her honey, and if you were here at the very, very beginning, you might have heard her talking about her honey library. So she's doing an event in person at Hiver. And then we've also got a photography competition running because we want to display the winner on World Bee Day. That actually closes this time next week. So get your entries in soon. If there are any more questions, put them in the chat. I think we have just about 10 more minutes. I have a question, if I can remember it, which is just wondering if there is a role for honeybees in the messaging around saving the other bees, given that the threats to honeybees are also often threats to other pollinators and other insects.
Yeah, I do. I think so. I mean, I think, as I hope what came over is that I'm asking people to give equal thought to Apis, because we have this immense emotional connection with these bees that provide us with honey. Again, a lot of people don't understand that out of that 25,000 species of bee, there are only two sorts of bee that give us honey. One is the Melipone that Adam was talking about, the stingless bees, and the other is Apis. Apis is prodigious in its honey output, and it's been bred to be very placid and handleable most of the time, and it's been exported all over the world. So I think, again, it comes down to that thing of appropriateness. It is entirely appropriate to celebrate the honeybee, to use the honeybee in ways that we were talking about, in good and profitable and sustainable ways. But I think, should be talking always, particularly as anybody who has any influence in the bee world, should be talking constantly about the honeybee within the context of the wider world of bees and the ecology of bees. And there are a lot of food products that we depend on which are actually not pollinated by honeybees. They're pollinated by bumblebees, like tomatoes and stuff, or peppers. If we want biodiversity in food, I found myself the other day saying, if we want to continue to eat widely and well, we need to support the biodiversity of bees, and obviously that includes Apis and all its cousins, all its thousands and thousands of cousins. So I think it's not a question of saying, it's a them and us situation. It's a question of saying it's about the wide world of bees and all that it includes.
It can be very problematic, though. I'll just quickly share a story of how problematic. So about possibly 15 years or so ago, there was a parliamentary event where it was kind of it was organized by the Minister for Science at the time, and basically you had loads of people talking about the pollinator crisis, and MPs and the Lords could come in and get information from it. It's fairly informal. And the beginning of that was spent with about 5 or 10 minutes of someone saying, this is not about honeybees. We're not talking about honeybees. We will not talk about honeybees. And we didn't talk about honeybees, and everyone was talking about hoverflies and solitary bees. And then the next person would stand up, this is not about honeybees. And then I was there going, it's not about honeybees. And at the end of this, about 45 minutes of various people standing up, the predominant message of which was, it's not about honeybees. There's so many more pollinators. We need to worry about pollinators. We're like, any questions? And a load of MPs and people that I'd recognized at the time and Lords all put their hands up, and they all wanted to ask about honeybees, and they all wanted to share stories about their constituents who keep honeybees and how marvelous they are and how awful there is that they're in trouble and how their granddad kept bees. we were just there looking at each other thinking like, are we in the same room? Have we? And the reason is that honeybees, just even by mentioning bees, the word bee, everyone, it's dominated by honeybees at that point. And we couldn't work out how we could be more insistent it wasn't about honeybees than specifically saying it multiple times, and yet even that wasn't enough. And I think that is one of the problems of honeybees being in the conversation and being in people's mind, is that it's very, very hard to get away from, and that was quite frustrating.
The added joy which I grapple with daily is that if you show people a picture of a bumblebee and a honeybee, they will always, I mean, I'm not talking about people who know about bees, but normal people, they will always identify that bumblebee as being the creator of honey, and the other one, the wasp.
Yes, all the time.
It's just madness. There's just so many different levels to address it. I blame Disney big time for an awful lot of nonsense. But it is, a number of times that I've commissioned illustrations to go with things, decks of presentation, and some graphic design agency that the customer or client has had, and back it comes, and there's hives with bumblebees flying out. Yeah. So it's like illustrating a thing about rhinoceroses with pictures of hippopotami. It's just not the same thing, but it doesn't get through. It is a really tricky one. And I think I feel like the Grinch who stole Christmas a lot of the time, because I'm just sort of spending my life going, no, that's not right, let's get to and I fear that has to go on. All of us who are involved in trying to disseminate better information have to, and maybe, as you say, Adam, in 17 years or something, we'll all be sitting here going, isn't it fantastic that there's wide popular understanding of the great big world of bees? Wouldn't that be a joy? We could do that.
Oh, I love that.
Well, let's make the plan. We'll all come back here and
I
wouldn't put money on it.
Yeah, perhaps the next event should be called The Great Big World of Bees. And I think with that, we've just about at time, and I think we can wrap up with by 8 o'clock and let everyone go for their dinner. So just last thing to say is a big thank you to Adam and Sarah. I've really enjoyed it. I think everyone can agree that it's been illuminating and interesting and very entertaining. So a big thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and hopefully see you in London in person at Sarah's event, although there are only 22 tickets left for that, so buy them while you can. Okay. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.